Hi, I'm Phil Harbottle and this is my 54th video discussing British science fiction. In this video we're taking a look at Britain's pioneer science fiction magazine, Tales of Wonder. The first old science fiction magazine appeared in America in April 1926, Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories, followed by several others over the next decade, most notably Wonder Stories and Astounding Stories. British science fiction fans, however, would have to wait 11 years before Britain gained a comparable home-produced publication. In the interim, science fiction tales rarely appeared in British magazines, unless it was in the juvenile field. For British editors, science fiction had begun and ended with H.G. Wells so far as adult readers were concerned. A very few exceptions appeared in such magazines as Pearson's magazine, but usually what we would today term as borderline material. For the avid science fiction reader forced to prospect in the juvenile magazines, there were occasionally rewarding discoveries to be made. Lester Bidston ordered the Space Destroyer in a 1928 Boy's Friend. This told of a marvellous gravity-nullifying metal in a visit to Mars and Vulcan. The story had a sequel, Scund the Eternal, wherein Earth was bombarded by a huge cannon on Venus. Other ingredients were giant wasps, a heroine named Thensler, and a tough guy hero Scund who could not die. Naturally, there were 3 intrepid schoolboys mixed up in it somewhere. Thus, it was that in February 1934, when a juvenile science fiction magazine for boys, Scoops, was daringly launched by Pearson's, most of its readers were men. Walter Gillings, a young journalist living in Ilford, and later to become a pivotal figure in the history of British science fiction magazines, recalled having to sneak shamefaced into a newsagent's and ask for scoops, as though he were buying a halfpenny gobstopper, or assume the air of one doing his young brother a good turn. Behind its Sergei Dridgen two-tone covers, the blatantly juvenile sensationalism of Scoops thus assumed the proportions of a ghastly mistake. Here we'll see an article I published a few years ago on the Scoops magazine. See the blatantly juvenile nature of the covers. I don't know if you can pick up some of the titles of the stories there, which will give you some idea of the juvenile contents, as evidenced in the illustration there. So Scoops was another juvenile publication. To his credit, the editor, Hayden Dimmick, eventually realised this. From number 13, which we see here, author bylines were added to the previously mostly anonymous contents. Stories took on a reasonably adult air, and Conan Doyle's classic, The Poison Belt, was serialised. Named contributors to later issues included John Russell Fearn. The story called Invaders from Time. Fearn was then just beginning to make his name in Astounding Stories in the US after debuting the previous year in Amazing. Another credited author was Wilfred P. Cockcroft, a Halifax writer, then just beginning his career as a British science fiction writer. But by then it was too late. The magazine was already sliding out of existence. Scoops folded after 20 issues in June 1934. But in its death throes, it spawned this 1937 annual, Newton's Boy's World of Adventure. But despite its stringent spaceship cover, of its 13 stories, only 3 were Scoops related. There were reprints from the earlier issues of Scoops, and there was 3 leftover unused science fiction stories, but the majority of its contents were juvenile schoolboy sports stories, and only 2 of its 4 colour plates illustrated science fiction stories. There's the remaining science fiction one, and just come to it. There we are. That's it. So this publication is really, it's very borderline. It's just for mad completists. But it was a postscript to Scoops. But the march of magazine science fiction in Britain was not to be denied. During the early 30s, American pulp magazines, including the science fiction titles, such as Wonder Stories there, began to be imported into this country to appear on the remainder stalls. Legend has it that they were sent over as ship's ballast. This was manna from heaven to the British fans, and the readers' correspondence columns in the magazines quickly became a focal point for a previously scattered British fandom. Wonder Stories went so far as to label its August 1935 letter department as a British edition. This undercurrent of British science fiction response generated a flickering spark at the publishing house of George Newnes, an associate company of Pearson's. John Russell Fearn was one of the first of a handful of former Scoops practitioners to receive a letter from Newnes editor T. Stanhope Sprigg, dated 17th of September 1935. It read, "Dear Sir, I understand from Mr. Hayden Dimmick of The Scout that you contribute extensively to science fiction magazines in the United States. We are interested in the English market for this type of fiction, and we write to inquire whether you have available any original stories which you would care to offer us. Alternatively, we should be interested to see some of your recent work already published in America, and of which the British serial rights are still available. Yours truly, Stanhope Sprigg, editor." A friend and correspondent of Fearn's, Walter Gillings, also received a letter on the strength of his having bombarded Scoops with letters offering advice. Gillings was then corresponding with practically all of the few science fiction writers in the country, and the call to arms soon reverberated all over Britain. Fearn and his recently widowed mother actually moved to Brighton from Blackpool, just to be nearer the source of the action. And Fearn bombarded Sprigg with manuscripts, including those that had fallen back on his hands with the sudden demise of Scoops. Eric Frank Russell pitched in with his own inimitable manuscripts, which had yet to create a tremendous impact on the science fiction world. But the overall response was disappointing to Newnes. The plain fact was that there were only a handful of genuine British science fiction writers. The paucity of good manuscripts caused the magazine to be delayed. Some 3 Newnes pulp magazines were duly launched over 1935-36, but the 4th, already identified as fantasy, still failed to appear. As increasing doubts as to the validity of the magazine crept into the mind of its editor, it was eventually shelved, to the annoyance of Fearn, who promptly upped sticks and moved back to Blackpool. Now, Walter Gillings had been acting as an unpaid agent and consultant to authors, trying to provide Newnes with material. and he was too avid a fan to let 18 months of work die. In January 1937, he launched the first printed fan magazine in Britain, Science Fiction, a thoroughly professional-looking journal. Thoroughly professional-looking because Gillings was a professional journalist. And it provided a magazine of science fiction news and comment, and all the latest information on the American magazines. And through its interviews, it familiarized admirers with such authors as Benson Herbert, John Bain Harris, Festus Pragnell, Fern, Eric Frank Russell, and even the great Olaf Stapleton. Let's take a look at some of these. This one has an interview with John Bain Harris, who was later to become famous as John Wyndham. Interview with John Bain Harris. This one is Festus Pragnell, a British writer. Festus Pragnell. He'd been a contributor to Scopes. This interview here is no less than the great Olaf Stapleton. Page 8. There we see him. One of the greatest British writers of science fiction, Olaf Stapleton. The interview was actually conducted by Eric Frank Russell and his friend Leslie Johnson, and then written up by Gillings. Just look at a couple of more. Oh, this is Eric Frank Russell. Later become a famous American science fiction magazine contributor. Here with him. John Russell Fern. Page 8. The man with the ideas. So this was an excellent magazine. Excellent fanzine. Now then, after he launched the magazine, Gillings heard a rumour that was actually unfounded. It had arisen because World's Work of publishers were issuing pulp magazines with the titles of Tales of Terror and Tales of the Unknown. They continued these weird magazines, but they had no science fiction magazine in mind until Gillings approached them. The result of his efforts and the strength of sending copies of his professional-looking fanzine was that Gillings was commissioned to produce a new professional science fiction magazine to be published by World's Work, Tales of Wonder. He was given a trial issue, the first issue, of 80,000 words. Some of the material could be of American origin, so long as it not appeared in remainders sold in England. But because World's Work reprinted American stories for the other magazines, Gillings was severely handicapped by having to operate with the same reprint rate of payment, just 10 6 1,000 words top rate. Nevertheless, authors rallied round with enthusiasm. Manuscripts returned from fantasy were dusted off and sent to Gillings along with new stories. The low rate of payment was happily accepted with the thought that this was a beginning being made for British science fiction. The summer 1937 first issue, which we see here, is now a rare collector's item. The cover story, Superhuman, the contents page there, the cover story, Superhuman, was attributed to Jeffrey Armstrong, but it was actually written by John Russell Fearn. Gillings, without Fearn's knowledge, had switched the name on it because of his use in using another Fearn story in the same issue, Seeds from Space. And he couldn't have two stories by the same author appearing in a magazine. Armstrong had been chosen because it was Fearn's mother's maiden name, appearing on his letterhead as his secretary, F.R. Armstrong. The genial Fearn accepted the fait accompli quite happily, and this marked his first venture into the realm of pen names. Superhuman would be later reprinted under his own name in the American Startling stories. Other stories which we see on the contents panel there included Eric Frank Russell's The Prit, voted the most popular story in the issue, and others were by John Bain and Harris, Festus Pragnell, who had a second under the name Francis Parnell, and the second offering from Fearn under his own name, Seeds of Space. Both Fearn stories had originally been written for Scoops and then quickly revised at Gillings' request. Halifax writer W.P. Cockcroft's Revolt on Venus had originally been written for Fantasy, and Scoops writer Maurice G. Hughie rounded off the issue with Invaders from the Atom. Sales were enough to prompt World's Work to continue Tales of Wonder on a regular quarterly schedule. While suitable new material continued to be at a premium, Tales of Wonder ran many reprints by, if you look, you can see the bylines there of veteran American writers such as David H. Keller, Stanton Coblentz, and Clark Ashton Smith. Later, Gillings acquired such remarkable early stories as Murray Leinster's The Mad Planet, and its sequel, The Red Dust. It's The Red Dust, very famous story by Murray Leinster. And there's a story. What was that? Bear with me. Here we are. There it is. The Mad Planet. Very famous story by American veteran author. Other Americans reprinted were Jack Williamson, whose debut story, The Metal Man, together with his classic The Moon Era, appeared. Bear with me. There we see The Moon Era by Jack Williamson. The little illustrations were by fan artist Harry Turner. Tales of Wonder's low budget didn't permit proper illustrations, just little postage stamp size ones by a fan artist. Gillings had judged these old reprints introduced the old-time adventuresome elements, which would make the magazine more accessible to new readers in Britain not well versed in current American science fiction. Undoubtedly, however, it annoyed British authors trying to sell new stories. After selling a third Old Scoops manuscript Through Earth's Core to the second issue, Yeah. Fern sold an old Scoops story. Well, it had been sent back from Scoops through Worth's Core. After selling that story, Fern found that all his new stories were being rejected because they were too advanced, according to Gillings, for a British audience. Other authors were also getting their stories rejected because they were too advanced, such as Fern's friend Leslie J. Johnson. Gillings was obsessed with what he perceived to be the need to keep his stories simple and plausible to the British general public, rejecting anything he judged too widely imaginative. Both Fern and Johnson vented their ire with articles in contemporary British fanzines, Fern using satire and mild reproof in his article Kindergarten Science Fiction in the Futurian, whilst Johnson, writing in Satellite, was more openly scathing in his condemnation of the go slow policy. Gillings was upset at these attacks and responded by rejecting the next news stories Fern sent him. Here we see Fern's article attacking Gillings' policy of not using advanced science fiction. This was appearing in the American magazines. There we go. Gillings was furious with Fern for the attack. So he rejected all the news stories that Fern sent him. Then, realizing he needed Fern as a name in his magazine, Gillings attempted a rapprochement by reprinting Fern's first short story, The Man Who Stopped the Dust, from the March 1934 Astounding. Where's the story? Oh, here we are. The Man Who Stopped the Dust, reprinted from Astounding. But since Fern could readily sell his news stories to the American magazines at 2 guineas a 1,000 words, 4 times the payment rate of Tales of Wonder, after a while he understandably gave up submitting and didn't appear again after Dust was reprinted in the 8th issue. Instead, he resumed his regular sales to the American magazines. See my video number 52. One author who was able to meet Gillings' editorial policy, although mostly with old Wonder Stories reprints, was John Bain Harris, later to become John Wyndham, as I've mentioned a few times. And the second issue presented something of a scoop. Sleepers of Mars by John Bain was a short story sequel to his book, Stowaway to Mars, also known as Planet Plane, that had been published by Nunes. Very famous book. Now, the magazine did present some interesting stories by such fledgling authors as William F. Temple, remembered especially for his stories Experiment in Genius and Smile of the Sphinx. There's the Smile of the Sphinx. That story was later reprinted in an American magazine. Let's see. Find his Experiment in Genius. Where was that one? There we are. Experiment in Genius by William F. Temple. Likewise, Eric Frank Russell, whose humorous tales included I Spy. Let's see here, number 9, I Spy. Famous story by Eric Frank Russell that was also later reprinted in American magazines. And even the illustrious Arthur C. Clarke failed to sell his early fiction to Gillings. It was too wildly imaginative for the cautious editor. But Clarke did make his first professional sale to Tales of Wonder with a non-fiction article on space travel and the solar system. We'll see that one. You see it? Oh no, that's not it. That's it. Arthur C. Clarke's first professional appearance in any magazine was in Tales of Wonder. Clarke was introduced as an amateur astronomer. The success of Tales of Wonder served to jog the reluctant Nunes into reviving the plans for their 4th magazine, and in July 1938, editor Sprigg finally brought out Fantasy. In its higher rates of pay, twice that of World's Work, attracted new stories by Fern, Russell and John Bain Harris. The first issue compared well with Tales of Wonder, where the budget only permitted the use of small illustrations by noted fan artist Harry Turner. Fantasy, on the other hand, was comparatively lavish in production, with covers by ex-Scoops artist Sergei Dridgen, a very competent professional artist. It also boasted several interior artists, all of whom worked in Nunes' other magazines. Featured in the first issue was a new novelette by Fern, specially written for Sprigg, The Red Magician. There we see The Red Magician by Fern. And there were also equally good stories by Eric Frank Russell. And John Bain, nowadays known as John Wyndham. And see the nice illustrations which the Nunes were able to use. There was still a shortage of suitable new material despite the respectable rates of pay, for Sprigg also had to fall back on reprints from Pearson's magazine, which we see there with G.R. Malick's The Winged Terror, the giant caterpillar, and we see it there where the story was reprinted in Fantasy with a striking cover by Dridgen. Also in the second issue was a strong novelette by Fern, Climatica. There we see it. Climatica by Jonathan Fern. And also regulars in the Nunes publication would be John Bain. Story there, The Trojan Beam. That story had actually been rejected by Gillings the previous year. And Frank Russell appeared with another story there, Vampire of the Void. And that story would be later reprinted decades later in an American magazine. Such was its quality. Sprigg had been mobilised out of the reserves into the Royal Air Force, and the last issue he published before he was called up was this third issue in June 1939, featuring The Derelict of Space by John Bainan. See that story. And Bainan had another story, is by Wyndham Parks, which you can see there, which was another pairing of his multiple middle names. And Eric Frank Russell also distinguished himself by appearing in all 3 issues of the magazine. But when the editor was called up from the reserves into the Royal Air Force, with its guiding editor gone, the magazine's continuance looked uncertain. Not previously recorded in any science fiction histories is the fact that Newn's general editor, F.J. Cam, took over from Sprigg and at first only suspended the magazine, intending to restart it at a later date. Fern's letters to Temple, in my possession, show that Fern continued to send manuscripts to Cam for some time, even having his story Blind Vision, the British version of his amazing story The Man Who Saw Two Worlds, accepted for fantasy in January 1940. However, it would never be published because Cam finally decided to fold the magazine, making fantasy the first casualty of the war. Tales of Wonder, however, lasted until the spring of 1942. Paper rationing had gradually cut down the number of pages to just 76, including recycled covers. The 16th issue was to be the last. See the 16th issue. Gillings' editorial spoke of the difficulty he was having in obtaining new works by British authors because many of the writers had been caught up in the war. He still managed to feature a new novelette by Benson Herbert, The Earth Shall Die, and a first story by perhaps Britain's only female science fiction writer at that time, Secret of the Crater by Marion F. Eady, who would later married to the magazine's talented fan artist, Harry Turner. There we see it. First story by a British female science fiction writer, who was later to marry the artist who illustrated her story, Harry Turner. The rest of the issue was made up of American reprints by Clark Ashton Smith and Miles J. Brewer. Now, overprinted at the side of the magazine, you see there, was a sad announcement. Since this issue went to press, we've been obliged, owing to paper restrictions and war conditions generally, to discontinue this magazine while the war lasts. No further issues will appear until peace comes, when we hope to resume publication as before. It was a tragedy for British science fiction. Because the magazine, had it continued, would undoubtedly have introduced new British talent. that would have emerged much sooner than it eventually did. An example of this we see on page 53 with the announcement of a forthcoming story, Before the Flood, by John F. Burke. Of course, that story never appeared and was lost. And Burke's notable career in science fiction writing would have to wait many years, until 1953 in fact. However, the die had been cast by all these early publications, proof that Britain could support itself in the field, and proof of the determination of these early fans to produce a professional magazine of British science fiction.